for the invitation. Thank you for letting me be here with you again, and thank you for you being here to be able to come out on a Wednesday night, to be able to have this series and to be able to talk about these things. As Brian mentioned, and Brian probably doesn't know how scared I was that I would never be invited back here again. The last time we were trying to do the summer series here, and he had graciously invited me, this thing called COVID happened. And what he said was to all the speakers was just record it, email it to me, send it to me on tape, and then we'll just play it on Wednesday night. And he didn't know that I have no idea how to do any of that. And so he got it all set up, and I came over here one afternoon, and I recorded it in the library with the church equipment. The one thing he said was, whenever if you mess up, don't worry about it. Just tell me, and I'll go back and piece the tape together. And all I know is when I left the building that day, I just looked at him and said, good luck to you. I didn't think I was ever coming back here with that. But thank you I hope it's better in person than maybe what it is on tape. I love the series that you're having as well. I love this series about being all in, this idea of the things that we do, these different aspects and areas of our life, that we have to be all in with Jesus, that we have to be all in with God, that God doesn't let us just come in part way. And God's not going to let us just kind of take half and leave the other half. And it's something we have to be all about. And tonight, we're going to be looking at one of those great passages, one of those easy passages that you know very well without even looking up, Matthew chapter 22. And it's really verse 37 that's going to be the key. We'll go back and look at context here in just a minute. But when you think about this statement, Jesus is being asked and he's being questioned, and his response to the great commandment is, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. One of the things that has been impressed upon me from Scripture in the past couple of years especially is that when you read through Scriptures, there's a lot of things that we might call commands, a lot of things that God dictates and expects, and I'm not trying to diminish those commands. But there's also some statements that are made throughout the Bible that if you can remember the principle behind them, and if you can kind of get the big picture of what that passage or what that verse is about, it really helps you in life. For instance, if you will, when you think back to Matthew chapter 7 and verse 12, whatever you would that men should do to you, I believe the King James says, do also to them. Now we call it the golden rule. Treat others the way that you would have them treat you. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And that's a command that we have from the Bible. And if you really don't know the verse, but you know the principle behind it, then it helps to dictate the attitude you have in life. When you go to a restaurant, maybe your server is not up to par. You ask yourself, well, how, if I was in their situation, how would I want to be treated? And so you treat them the way that you want them to treat you. All aspects of life could fall into that. Maybe you think of a passage such as Matthew chapter 16 and verse 16, where Peter was going to say to Jesus in response to a question, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And there's a whole lot of implications that we could be given, that we could see about Jesus being the Christ. But if you live your life as if Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, it's going to have a great impact on your life. More so than just a few verses you find in the book of Matthew, it's going to impact your life. And it's one of those founding principles that we have in the Bible. And the same is true with our text today. If we can really learn what it means, if we can get the principle behind, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. If we can really get that into our hearts, if you will, how much better can life be? How much better can our worship be? How much better can our words be? How much better can our relationships with one another be if we go and remember the principle? Now, there's a great context that is given with this particular passage, and we're not going to read all of the context to it. We just kind of set the stage for us. You know, in chapter 22, Jesus is being questioned by the Pharisees and the Sadducees. One of the things that both of these groups of individuals like to do was they love to challenge Jesus. They love to come after him, trying to trap him in his words. And you see that beginning in verse 15, when the Pharisees come to Jesus and they start questioning him about taxes. And Personally, I kind of wish Jesus answered the question a little bit different than he did, but he didn't, so we still follow it. But he was asked, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? And there's reasons why they asked that question. They were trying to trap him, the text tells us. And I really wish Jesus would have said, if you're a faithful child of God, you don't have to pay taxes to Caesar. But he didn't say that. So what he does say, though, is render to Caesar the things that are Caesar, to God the things that are God's. But the purpose is they were trying to trap him. They were trying to catch him in his words. They were trying to trick him in what he would say. And you go a little bit further and you get to about verse 23 and you start reading about the Sadducees that would come onto the picture. Not believing in the resurrection of the dead, they come to Jesus and they give this, I'll be nice and just say a very wild scenario of this individual, this woman who would marry this brother, and he died having no children, and so by law she married the next brother, and he died having no children. All 7 had her as wife, and they're trying to trick Jesus to say, this is how ridiculous your view of the resurrection is. That's what they're saying to Jesus. Whose wife will she be in the resurrection? And you know the response that Jesus gives, but again, our purpose is not necessarily the response, it's just the fact that they were coming to Jesus and questioning him. And now when you get to verse 34, you've got another question that is going to be asked of Jesus. The Pharisees are going to come back on the scene when they heard that he had silenced the Sadducees. They gathered together. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him and saying, Teacher, what is the great commandment in the law? There's a couple things about that. Number one, they're trying to test Jesus. Now, I would be very clear if I was talking to individuals, and if you hear me preach, you'll know that sometimes I say we've got to be very careful when we assign motives to individuals. That we don't have the privilege of knowing exactly what the motive of an individual is when they ask a question and maybe by the life they live. So we need to be very, very careful when we start assigning motives to individuals. For instance, I know of people who have told me that they've got very mad at somebody. And I ask them why they're mad at them, and they say, well, I was in Walmart and he ignored me. And it's somebody that I know. When I go and ask the person that supposedly, I said, did you see so-and-so? And no, where do they see me at? Well, it's at Walmart. Well, it's a big store. Sometimes people don't pay as much attention when they go to Walmart as they do when they're in other situations in life. But people get really mad, and they start to make assumptions about somebody's motive. He saw me, and I know he did, and he doesn't like me. He's mad at me. And it's kind of funny until you realize that I didn't make anything up. And we're talking about brethren who are assigning motives to other people, and so it's very dangerous and it's very difficult. So don't assign motives, but the motive here is clear because the inspired writer tells us the motive. They were testing Jesus. They wanted to find some way to be able to trap him. They wanted to find some way to be able to give an excuse to execute him at some point. That's what they were looking for. So then they asked a question. The lawyer asked a question. What is the great commandment in the law? I don't know if Brian has done this or not. I'm telling you, I have not done it, and I don't plan on doing this anytime soon. But some that have said that there are somewhere between 600 and 1,000 laws in the Old Testament. And it really just depends on where you divide the law as to one law having 3 parts or it being 3 laws. So whoever takes the time to go back and count that, how many laws are there? And you could really start in about Exodus chapter 20 or so. And you could go on down to the end of the book of Deuteronomy and you see law after law after law. Command after command after command. And how many are there? If I were to ask you that, which one would rise to the level of being the most important? Which one of those statements made by God through Moses was going to be the one that elevated itself to the top of the list? If you were to ask a man that, just anybody on this earth that, there might be all kinds of answers that you would give. And maybe some of them would make some type of sense, but most of them would probably not make as much sense when you said, well, yeah, but what about this or what about that? And it's a trap. It's a testing question is what it is. It's a question that this lawyer was asking because he thought he had something on Jesus, but it's then that Jesus is going to make the statement. And it's with that Jesus is going to give the great command. Jesus answers and he says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind." And he follows that up in verse 38 by saying, "This is the first and great commandment." Jesus takes all those laws that had been written, all those things the lawyer would have known, all the things the Pharisees and the Sadducees would have seen, all the things that they believed in, and he boils it down to one. If you want to know what the greatest command is, love God with all that you have. That's why I said earlier, this is one of those defining principles of life. It's really one of those things that if you can put on and get into your mind and into your heart, if you can let it show through your life, then how much greater can life be? Jesus takes all the laws and he breaks it down into one simple command. Now, our purpose is not to talk about the second command, but very briefly, you understand Jesus follows it up in verse 39. He says, "The second like it is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself." And then he adds in verse 40, "On these two commands hang all the law and the prophets." If you want to know how to live life today, follow these two principles. And yes, they're more than principles, they're commands, but follow these principles. Love God and love your fellow man. Question is, what does Jesus mean by this? Perhaps there's a lot of ways that we could go tonight to look at this, and some writers that I have read and studied on that, they make a big distinction between the heart and the soul and the mind, and there are distinctions about that, but sometimes when I start trying to figure that out, I kind of get lost in it. And sometimes it gets a little bit too deep, and if you know me very well at all, you know it doesn't have to be very deep before it's way over my head. So I try not to get too terribly deep with things like that. But you think about the heart and you think about the emotional impact that we have, the emotional well-being that we have. You think about the soul. It's that part of us that lives forever. It's that part of us that is never going to die no matter what happens to us physically. It's going to be around somewhere for eternity. You think about the mind, the intellect, the decision-making process that we go through, deciding what to do and when to do it and how to do it. And you put those together, and you've got this picture that Jesus is giving. Jesus says you've got to love God with everything that you have. You've got to love God with all of your being. Here's the question we want to answer tonight. Really, two questions. Number one, where did Jesus get this command? And number two, why is it a command to love God? Why would Jesus say it? Where does it come from? And what's the purpose of it? And that's what we hope to do for the remaining of our time this evening. When you think about the origin of that command, you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 6. It really starts before that. If you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 5, you start to see where Moses is going to reiterate to the children of Israel the Ten Commandments. It's a time in the history of Israel when they're going to be going into the land of Canaan, where they are just about to go take this land that God has given to them. Moses has already reminded them in the first 4 chapters about where they had been and where they were going, but he tells them these commandments in chapter 5. And he reminds them of a few more principles that they need to know, a few more commands. And then he gets to chapter 6 and he makes this statement. He says in verse 4, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." And he says, verse 5, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength." That was the first time, at least to my knowledge, that command is given like that in the Bible. That they were commanded previously to love God, but the first time it was given in that particular manner. And that's the one Jesus is referring to. Jesus says, go all the way back to the beginning. Go all the way back to when the command was given. Go all the way back to the very beginning, the very basics of when this was provided, and think about what it meant. You see, there's something interesting about that. If you just stop there and read that, then you see a command that is given. And you basically see an order that God has given, a directive that God provides for the people. This is what you are going to do. You shall love the Lord your God. But I want to broaden the picture just a little bit. Why did Israel love God? I don't know if you've ever been around people that were, we'll just say, hard to love. People that might be a little bit difficult to get along with. Maybe it's somebody that likes to argue all the time. Maybe it's somebody that's always got a one-up story. No matter what you say, they've got a better story to tell. Or maybe it's somebody that everything's just so bad and they're complaining all the time. But whatever the case is, somebody that's just difficult to love. They're difficult to be around. And we know we should love them because we know Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. So we know we should love them, but it can be a challenge. It can be draining emotionally and physically to be around people like that. Why did Israel love God? It's not just that God was sitting up in heaven and that God was looking out over the children of Israel and He says, let me tell you what you're going to do, like it or not. Let me tell you what you're going to do and you have no choice in the matter. That's not what God was doing at all. God says you shall love Him with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. You're going to love God like that way. That is the command. But here's why. And notice from the rest of this chapter, from verse 10 on, notice what God is saying to them. And notice what God is reminding them of. He says in verse 10, so it shall be when the Lord your God brings you into the land which He swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give you large and beautiful cities which you did not build, houses full of all good things which you did not fill, hewn out wells which you did not dig, vineyards and olive trees which you did not. You have eaten and are full. Then beware, lest you forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. You shall fear Him, you shall fear the Lord your God and serve Him, and shall take oaths in His name. Did you catch that? Did you catch the way God started, or at least the way Moses in giving this command from God? He says, look, let me tell you what you're about to do. You're about to go into a land that you didn't, houses that you didn't build. You're going to sit on furniture that you didn't make. You're going to drink from wells that you didn't dig. You're going to eat fruit from trees that you did not plant. And who is it that's giving you these things? And the answer was obvious. It was God doing that. The Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. It's not as if God just gave a command and said, deal with it. God gave the command and said, and let me show you how much I love you. After you go down a little bit, you get to verse 16, and He talks about not tempting them. He talks about some of the things that God gave, and you go down to verse 20, and He says, when your sons ask you in time to come, saying, what is the meaning of the testimonies, the statutes, the judgments which you have, or which the Lord our God has commanded you? Think about those words for a minute. The testimonies, the statutes, the judgments, the commandments. If you want to hear some bad words in church, just stand up and talk about the judgments and the statutes and the commandments that we have. Because those things are not seen as popular in our world today. They're not really seen as nice terms, even in religious circles most of the time. But when your kids start asking you, what's the purpose of the testimonies and the statutes and the judgments and the commands? Here's what you say to them, verse 21. You shall say to your son, we were slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt, and the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. And the Lord showed signs and wonders before our eyes, great and severe, against Egypt, Pharaoh, and his household. Then He brought us out from there that He might bring us in to give us the land of which He swore to our fathers. Then it was, verse 24, the Lord commanded us to observe these statutes, to fear the Lord for our good always, that He might preserve us alive as it is this day. Did you catch what God said? When your kids ask you what's the purpose of the commandments and the judgments and the statutes and why does God have all these laws, what do you tell them? Because God gave us freedom. God delivered us. Because we were slaves in the land of Egypt and God brought us out with a mighty hand. And God brought us into this place that we're going to be living, that we did not work for, that we did not earn, that we did not deserve. That's what God did for us. And really what Moses is saying to the children of Israel, and really what God is saying to the children of Israel is, I'm giving you a reason to love me. I am giving you a reason to give me your all. I'm giving you a reason as to why you would want to bow down before me. It's not as if it is just a baseless command. It is God saying, here is the reason. And you know, when we fast forward to the New Testament, we talk about loving the Lord our God, and we ask ourselves the question, why? Why would we love God? And you know the answer. It's not exactly the same words as what God used with Israel, but it's the very same principle. You know 1 John chapter 4 and verse 19, we love Him because He first loved us. We love God because the first thing that He did was show us love. And if you read throughout the book of 1 John, it makes it very clear as to what God has done, along with some other things. God has given us His Son. And God has given us a way in which you and I can find ourselves living with Him forever in heaven. That is what God has done. We love God not because there's some baseless command for it. Not because God is threatening us in some way. We love God because He loved us first. And because He was willing to do something for us that we could not do for ourselves. He sent His only begotten Son. You're familiar with the passage in Romans chapter 8. It's one of those great chapters in the Bible. When you start looking at the end of Romans chapter 8, you get down to about verse 31, and Paul is going to start asking some questions. What shall we say then? If God is for us, who can be against us? And then he says in verse 32, He who did not spare His own Son, but delivered Him up for us all, how shall He not with Him freely give us all things? And without even going any further in the text, you understand what Paul is saying. If we're on the side of God, if God is with us, what other reason is there to fear? Because if God was willing to give His Son, if God did not spare the death of His only begotten on the cross, what else is there that He's not going to do for us? If He was willing to give us the very best, then what is it that He would withhold from us? And you know the obvious answer. In fact, Paul, just to make sure we know, he answers the question. And you get down to verse 38, and he says, I am persuaded that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor height, nor depth, nor any other created thing shall be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus. What is it that can separate us from His love? The answer is nothing. Now, there's ways we can separate ourselves from Him, but there's no way we can separate ourselves from His love. Because God loves us. And God was willing to give us the very best. And God was willing to provide for us everything that we need so that we can stand before Him one day. So that we can have our sins washed away by the blood of His Son. So that we could live forever with Him. So that we could love the Lord our God with all of our heart, with all of our soul, and with all of our mind. Take a step back and look at that passage from Matthew chapter 22, and you start to see the implications of it. You go back to the beginning and you get to the origin of it, where God told the children of Israel, you're going to love me. You're going to be pleasing to me. You are going to love me. And He tells them why. Because here's what I'm doing for you. Here's the love that I have for you. And Jesus today tells us that we are to love the Lord our God with all that we have. And He says, and let me tell you why you can love God. Because God already loves you. Because God has made a way. God has provided. God has given you all the things that you need for eternity. So we know the origin. We know the why. How does it work in real life? You know, sometimes we think about the passage you see on the screen in John chapter 14, and there's a few others in John chapter 14 and a little bit in chapter 15 that, I'll be honest, I'm not sure I always used them the way they were intended. Now let me be clear. What Jesus says stands for itself. If you love me, keep my commandments. And you go down to verse 21 of John chapter 14, and he talks about this is how He knows those that love Him, if we keep His commandments. And he goes on down to say, and if we don't love Him, then we don't keep his commandments. And if we don't keep his commandments, then we don't love him. And he goes into John 15 and verse 14. He says, you are my friends if you do whatever it is I have commanded you. I don't want to take obedience off the table because God expects us to obey. And let me just be very clear. If you're living your life and you do not obey God, you will not go to heaven. And that's not my words. That's the words of Jesus himself. But sometimes, I'm afraid, and I'm just speaking from personal experience, and I don't know if it applies to you or anybody here or not, but I'm afraid sometimes I used passages such as this a lot more like a sledgehammer than I would a scalpel. I used them more to kind of beat people into submission. You are going to do what God says no matter what, instead of, here's what God wants us to do, and trying to get to the heart of the matter. Because there's a lot of things in life that can be difficult, and there's a lot of things in life that can be challenging, and the reason why I do the things that I do, and the reason why you do the things that you do, the reason we all ought to be doing the things that we do, is because of the love that we have for God, because of what God has done for us. So how does all that play out in my life? What's the result of all of that? The result is, if I love God with all of my heart, with all of my soul, and with all of my mind, then I'm going to make every effort to worship him. I remember back a few years ago, it's probably been 14, 15 years ago, and I hope y'all don't run me out of the building when I say this, but I am a Tennessee fan. I grew up in Tennessee. I am a Tennessee football fan. I'm just prefacing the conversation that way. My brother called me and said he had a couple of tickets to the Tennessee-Vanderbilt game, which I know were not hard to get, but these were on the third row behind the Tennessee bench. And so he said, if you want to go, meet me in Nashville, told me where and all that. So I went to the game with him. And while I was sitting there at the game with him, there was a family of four behind me. I never turned around to see who they were. I don't know what they looked like. I have no idea. But at one point, about midway through the second quarter, this young man who was probably 14, 15, maybe 16 years old, he turned around to his dad and said, hey, so-and-so, my friend, just sent me a text and asked if I wanted to spend the night with him tonight, and we'll go to the park tomorrow. And his dad said, son, that's not what we do on Sundays. On Sundays, we go to church as a family. And so, no, you can't go spend the night with your friend because we're going to be in worship. And I'm sitting there, and I don't turn around. I don't say anything. It's not my conversation, but I was kind of proud of the dad for saying that. Until the third quarter. He got a phone call. Got off the phone, told his wife, hey, my buddy, he just said that so-and-so backed out. They've got tickets to the Titans game tomorrow, and the parking lot opens at 9 a.m., and we're going to tailgate before the game. And his 13 or 14 or 15, 16, however old he was, son looked at his dad and said, hey, Dad, what about going to church on Sunday? And his dad said, one Sunday's not a big deal. If I love God with all that I have, with all of my heart, with all my soul, and with all my mind, then when my Little League baseball coach calls me and says, we've got a tournament that we're playing on Sunday morning, the first game is at 9:30, I expect you to be there. If you love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, you're going to make every effort to be in worship. You'll tell the coach you'll see him for the second game after that. Or when your buddy calls you and says, hey, I've got a tee time at the Elusive Country Club and come on and play. We tee off at 9 o'clock Sundays. Man, that sounds like fun, but I can't do it. You got a prior commitment. You see, all of a sudden, loving God with all of our heart, with all of our soul, and with all of our mind, it's not now just something we say to appease people. Now it's a manner of life that we live. Because Hebrews 10 is very clear that when we come together, we are to encourage one another, to stir up love and good works. And we're not to forsake the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some is, but we exhort one another so much more as we see the day approaching. And I know the context of it, that if you go back to verse 22, it's about people who had already given up on. But let me tell you this. If you're willing to skip church for a baseball game, or for a round of golf, or for a shopping trip, or for whatever else you want to fill in the blank with. Maybe it is you've already given up on faith. Maybe it is you've already lost sight of what's important. Or do you love God with all that you have? It's a challenge for us. If I love God with all of my heart, with all of my soul, and with all of my mind, then I'm going to be careful with my words. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 29 reminds us that we're to let no corrupt communication proceed out of our mouth, but that which is good for necessary edification, that it may impart grace to the hearers. You ever been frustrated with a telemarketer? You ever been in the middle of something and the phone rings and it takes your attention away and you answer and it's somebody wanting to know if you want to buy whatever, or some recording and you can't understand a word they're saying? And how easy is it to get frustrated with them? And how easy it is to kind of lash out, because it's just a nameless person on the other end of the computer. They'll never know who it is anyway. They don't even know what number they called. It's just a random computer number to them. Or do I watch my words when I'm around them? And when I go to work on a Monday morning and I'm around a group of friends and maybe they're telling some stories that may not be real good for a Christian, and I start thinking, I remember this joke that I heard one time, and boy, I could get a lot of good laughs if I tell it. It's got a couple of bad words, but it would really get a laugh. And the temptation is to tell it. But you see, if I can remember that I love the Lord my God with all of my heart, with all of my soul, and with all of my mind, then it helps me to be able to control the words that I use. And it may help me when somebody's talking negatively about somebody, that maybe I can say something that's encouraging about that person. Or maybe if I know somebody's having a bad day, that I might be able to go up to them and just put my arm around them and just to be able to cheer them up just a little bit. Just to say something nice and kind and uplifting to them. Why would I do that? Why would I go out of my way to do something like that? It's because I love the Lord my God with all of my heart, with all of my soul, and with all of my mind. I'm going to look for opportunities to do good. If I love God with all of my heart, with all of my soul, and with all of my mind, then I'm going to do whatever I can. I'm going to resolve within myself to solve the problems that I might have with my brother, maybe even my brother who sins against me. This is just a John Voss observation, but I'm afraid that Matthew chapter 18 and verse 15 is one of the most ignored passages that we have in the New Testament. Jesus says, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he hears you, you've gained your brother. Now let me be very clear. If your brother does something to you, and you're going to do what Jesus says, it is awfully hard to confront somebody. It's scary to walk up to somebody and say, hey, I want to talk to you for a minute because I got a problem with you. I got a problem with what you did, or I got a problem with what you said, or I got a problem with this. That's hard. That's not easy. You're taking a lot of risk there because that person may just lash out at you. That person may say that it's none of your business, and that person may say, I really don't care if I hurt you or not. They may do that. But that doesn't take away the command that Jesus gives. That if your brother sins against you, you go and talk to your brother alone. Far too many times I'm guilty of trying to get other people to get on my side first, to make sure that I'm right about this, to make sure that I've got all my bases covered, to make sure that everybody knows he's wrong, and I'm going to go then talk to him now that everybody knows the story. How hard it is. By the way, from my experience, if you do go talk to your brother, about 90% of the time or so, the problem usually gets solved. Because your brother, being your brother, wants to have a good relationship with you. Your brother, being that same family, wants to mend things when they can. So relationships are healed. But why would I put myself out? And why would I go talk to my brother when he's got a problem, when I have a problem with him? Why would I go talk to him in that regard? Because I love God with all my heart, with all my soul and with all my mind. Because I love God with everything that I have. Not always easy, but it's the right thing to do. If I love God with all of my heart, with all of my soul, and with all of my mind, I'm going to walk in wisdom towards those who are outside of Christ. I don't think the Bible teaches us that our reputation is going to precede us to judgment, at least in terms of that my reputation is going to have something to say about my judgment. I don't think that's the case at all. Because sometimes a reputation is deserved and sometimes it's not deserved. And the reputation's in the eyes of God, and that's not in the eyes of God. So I don't think that reputation is going to be used in judgment for us. But I also know this. In Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 15, and also in Colossians chapter 4 and verse 5, the Apostle Paul tells us that we need to be very careful with how we act. We need to be very careful with how we walk. We need to be very careful with how we respond to those who are outside of Christ. Because I don't want to damage my influence. I don't want to damage the opportunity that I may have to tell somebody about Christ. I don't want to damage the influence if I tell them where I go to church, that they may look at me and say, well, if you go there, I don't want any part of that church. And so I'm careful as to how I walk. I'm careful with the words that I use with them. I'm gentle when I talk with them. I'm not being judgmental towards them. Even if they say something that is absolutely not true in the eyes of God, I try to correct them in humility when I can, but I'm kind to them and I'm gentle. And why would I not just prove that I'm right? Why would I not just show them how little they know by saying, turn to this verse and this verse and this verse, and let me prove why you're wrong on this? It's because I love God with all my heart, with all my soul, and with all my strength. And when I think about what God has done for me, and I think about that sacrifice that Jesus made for me on the cross, and when I think about what He went through so that I could have an opportunity to go to heaven, then I'm going to live my life in such a way as best as I can to give somebody else that opportunity. There's probably a lot of other things that we could bring up and a lot of other examples that we might be able to give, but it really just goes back to those words of Jesus in Matthew chapter 22. It really goes back to the question as to whether we love God and how we love God. Jesus was asked, what's the most important commandment that's been written? What is the most important thing that has ever been said? What is the most important thing that we could follow? The greatest principle of all time. Jesus says it's simple. The first and the greatest of these is this: you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. It's not always easy to do. It's easy to say. It's easy to stand up and talk about it. Easy to point fingers and say that's the way we ought to be doing it. It's easy to know what to do. Sometimes it's a little bit more difficult to put into practice. Sometimes it's more of a challenge to be a part of it. But here's the question: do you love God with all that you have? Do you love God with every fiber of your being? If you do, it means that I've got to give up my own will and I've got to give up my own way and I've got to follow after the ways of Christ. And I've got to follow after His will and I've got to follow after His command. And now those commandments don't seem so burdensome to me because I know the love that He has for me. And I know the sacrifice that He made and I know the price that He paid so that I could find myself in heaven. And I love God because of that. And I'm going to do everything I can not to let anything stand in the way between me and Him. That I'm not going to let anything on this earth come between me and Him. That He's going to have preeminence in all things. And that I'm going to be His faithful child. Do you love the Lord your God? Do you put Him first in all things? Do you make that sacrifice of your life to Him because of that sacrifice of His life that He made to you? Do you love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul? Maybe it is this evening as you're thinking about your life, as you're considering maybe some of the challenges that we go through in this world, maybe some of the difficulties that we have, maybe some of the problems even that you face. Do you love God with all that you have? Are you that faithful child of His? Do you belong to Him and have that eternity with Him? Maybe it is you're not that faithful child because you've never displayed that love that God has for you. You've never submitted to His will in baptism, having those sins being taken away by the blood of Jesus, being raised to walk in that newness of life, having confessed His great name before others, having repented, turned away completely of your sins and turned yourself towards Christ. Maybe it is you've done that, but maybe something else has gotten in the way. Maybe something else has come between you and God so that maybe in your life it's difficult to say whether you love God with all that you have because of something that's hindering. Maybe it is you need to come back to Him, to be restored, to have that love for Him, to rededicate that love to Him, to live that life that He would have you to live. Today, if you need to respond to Him, we encourage you to do that as together we stand and as we sing.
As I am without one plea, but that thy blood was shed for me, and that thou bidst me come to thee, O Lamb of God, I come, just as I am, and waiting not to rid my soul of one dark blot, to thee whose blood can cleanse each spot, O Lamb of God, I come, just as I am, thy love unknown has broken every barrier down, now to be thine, yea, thine alone, O Lamb of God, I come, I come.
Really appreciate that message tonight, John. It's always refreshing to be reminded of some of these passages that we are very familiar with, but always good to hear some new light on passages like that. So really appreciate that. Don't forget, next week we are going to continue with our summer series. Our speaker next week is Dale Jenkins. He'll be speaking on 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7, casting all our cares on Him. Let's go to God in prayer, and we'll be done for the evening.